Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 3 today. After Abner has gone into his previous master Saul's Pilagesh, his secondary wife, to be challenged by Saul's son Ishbaal, which leads Abner to get very angry and give up on Ishbaal and make a plan to go over to David, and that's what we're going to see today. So in the unit we're looking at here from 2:15 to 5, we're completed this first unit of the division between Judah and Israel over the monarchy, and now we're looking at the first attempt to broker a covenant here and bring things together. And by the time we get to 5:5, almost all of the house of Saul is eliminated from contention, as we'll see, with both Abner killed and Ishbaal killed. And by chapter 6, Michal will be in isolation, as the narrator tells us, not having children with David. And so throughout this, we're seeing how the narrator, or the writer behind the narrator, is shaping this to make everything inevitable that David would consolidate all the authority. But as many commentators, including Brooke Halpern, who we'll look at, and Joel Bate and others, David is all too often distant from violence. It's to his advantage here. So he's distant from the death of Abner, and he's distant from the death of Ishbaal, and yet both of those are to his advantage. So we're going to have to question how much the story is being set up to protect David from what is just the normal way in which kings consolidate power, which is to destroy all their rivals. And we'll see in the Solomon succession in 1 Kings, in the next generation, there's no compunction at all on Solomon's part to get rid of the people that were bothersome to David and that David tells him to get rid of, including those that Solomon finds bothersome in his own right. So it's a short narrative rhetorical issue here for kings to try to hide the violence they do in order to become kings. And that's one of my arguments for why this story makes sense to me as written at the time, rather than a couple hundred years later, as many, especially recent scholars, have suggested. In the time of Assyria, it would make sense after Assyria destroyed Israel, when Judah was left. But why all these details, and why show David so questionable if you're trying to establish a long monarchy of potentially forever, as we'll see in 2 Samuel 7, grounded in the house of David? So those are just questions we have to be looking at as we go. So having told Abner, or having told Ishmael that he's not a dog's head for Judah, or at least that was the implication, he sent messengers to David at Hebron. And let's look at our map for a little bit, just to see the politics of monarchy as we go here. So Abner and Ishbaal are up here at Mahanaim here, and David's at Hebron down here. And that's a good distance there. And yet the message seems to go with no time at all, and that's the way our story works. So David sent messengers, and as we saw in our keywords, in our keywords here, sent is a common issue here. We're seeing sent throughout a number of times, and yet interestingly, David receives this message as if he's talking to Abner in the first person. Let's look more closely at that. So he sent messengers, and a reminder that the messenger Malachim is very close to the word for angel here, for king rather. It's very close in both ways. Kings and angels and messengers are all very similar words, and we'll see that especially in chapter 11, when the time for kings or messengers to go into battle, as we'll see. So he sent messengers to David at Hebron, saying here, and as my note below has, there's no previous recorded speech from Abner to David, but there was David to Abner, and it's worth going back to see, because it's the only relationship we know of between the two of them, and it's very relevant to what we see here. So this is when David finds Abner and Saul in the cave and calls out this way. David called to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, saying, Abner, will you not answer? Then Abner replied, who are you that calls to the king? And note that I don't call that speaking to David, because he doesn't know who it is. Then David said to Abner, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy your lord the king, which of course is him, David. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed. See now, where's the king's spear, or the water jar that was at his head? And interestingly, the language of this first sentence here in verse 16, this thing that you have done is not good, literally this word that you've done not good, will echo directly into our immediate passage, as we'll see here, which is what David says, good, to his response. So it's certainly recalling that David had criticized Abner for not doing his job in relation to Saul, and he's certainly not doing that job in relation to the house of Saul now. He's being an open betrayer of the job that he had. So he starts with this rhetorical question, which is a very interesting one, not just from the perspective of whenever this story was written, but certainly from the perspective of the end of the Deuteronomistic history, because this phrase, to whom the land belonged, is 32 times and all but one in Deuteronomy and Joshua, which by almost all scholarly accounts was created in the reign of Josiah in the 7th century to justify Josiah, at least some version of it. And so that would not have been a phrase known, as at least certainly not as clearly at the time that 2 Samuel 3 was written. But from the time of the final audience, the answer to this is Yahweh. What does Abner imagine the answer to the question is, whom does the land belong? And literally it's to whom the land, or literally whom land. There's no the in Hebrew and there's no belong. So literally saying to whom land. The implicit answer seems to be David the king. But why is the land the issue? The people are the issue. He's going to offer to bring all the people over. And we've not seen David express concern with land in terms of natural resources, as we might put it, more in terms of booty, which is to say the things that people have, rather than say mining or farming or things like that. It's more that he's taken, made possessions rather than things from the earth. So it's really not a question of the land, it's a question of the people. But then he continues. And I note in the Hebrew there's an extra lamor here for saying, separating out this rhetorical question from Abner's proposal. So here's his proposal. Make your covenant with me. Notice it's imperative. Abner feels like it's okay for him to speak to the king in the imperative. There's no third person speaking, your servant, as people often do, and certainly as David spoke to Saul in 1 Samuel, speaking of himself as your servant or your slave. But Abner's speaking as an equal here. Make your covenant with me. And notice he's doing it in terms of a covenant. We've not necessarily seen covenants between people in this context before, or between Yahweh and David for that matter. We'll see more in chapter 7. But that's the proposal. And I will give you my support, or literally, and behold, leaving out as it always does, Vehenna, my hand is with you. And that will be important because the hand issue will come up again, as the face issue will come up again. Not quite in our verses, but as we'll see next time. So my hand will be with you literally to bring over, using a variation on the word shub for return. This is literally in the Hiphal, to bring over. It's 24 times in Samuel overall and 8 times in the Hiphal here, and only 2 other in 2 Samuel, as we'll see. But it's recalling the bringing over the ark back in 1 Samuel 5, and that'll anticipate 2 Samuel 6, when the question of bringing over the ark raises the question of what David's afraid of. We saw that Ishbaal was afraid of Abner, but we'll see that David is afraid of the ark and the power behind it in chapter 6. So this is Abner's proposal, and David responds like he's talking face to face. Notice it doesn't say he said to the messenger, and he's speaking in the first person here. So as Baden notes, even without specifics, David would have recognized Abner's overture immediately for what it was. Across the ancient Near East, a population on the verge of being conquered commonly relinquished its independence to maintain some internal stability, much like King Hezekiah of Judah did to the Assyrians after the Assyrians had conquered Israel, in order to remain a vassal of Assyria and maintain some independence, some small independence for Judah. So we'll see that again. And he said, good, Tov, I will make a covenant with you. Notice that this is personal. This is not the house of Saul and the house of David, or the house of Israel and the house of Judah. This is between Abner and David as 2 people, much like David had made a covenant with Saul's son Jonathan back in 1 Samuel. And so he's making a covenant with them, but one word I require. So notice the juxtaposition of Tov for good and one word, recalling what we just seen in 1 Samuel 26, where David said, the word that you're doing, Abner, is not good. But now he likes the word that Abner's proposing, but he has one more word to ask. Require, for some reason they put require to cover over the nice play on words, to ask, to sha'al. So he sha'als here. He wants to Saul something of Abner here. You shall never appear in my presence, and this is where it covers up face 3 times in the verse. You will not see me face to face unless you bring Saul's daughter Michal when you come to face me, or when you come to see my face. So that's the command here. And he only says it in these terms, in terms of the implied messenger going back to Abner. But then David sends messengers to Saul. And note, when David's responding, he doesn't know about what we know about the interaction between Abner and Ishbaal at Mahanaim. We don't know that, David doesn't know that Abner made an attempt to either usurp the throne or to make himself the right-hand man to Ishbaal by going into Saul's Pilagesh there, his secondary woman, Rizpah, but we know it. So we don't, from David's perspective, he doesn't know exactly why Abner's making this proposal, other than out of the general sense that Saul is dead. And he doesn't question it, but he puts his condition on it. To bring Saul's daughter Michal. Notice he doesn't say wife or woman. It will say in the next verse, my woman Michal, but here it's Saul's daughter Michal. That's the perspective from the angle of Abner there. And as my note below has, with Jonathan dead, David's only link to the house of Saul. And as it may note further below, says it serves as the parallel to Abner's going into the concubine. The securing of Saul's daughter is tantamount to securing the monarchy over Israel, much like Solomon will in taking Pharaoh's daughter in 1 Kings 3. And there we'll explore the relationship between Solomon and Egypt, which is implicit in the text there, using Baruch Halpern to help us. But that's a ways down the road. So, now David sent messengers to Saul's son Ishbaal back up to Mahanaim, presumably where Abner is still. So it's interesting that he's sending messengers to Ishbaal, even though he had the messengers from Abner right here that he could have sent it to. So separating out the return message to Abner from the message that he sends separately to Ishbaal here. As Brueggemann notes, David's desire for Michal is likely an attempt to gain support from the Saulite faction rather than an act of personal love, although we did hear back in 1 Samuel that Michal loved David, at least according to Saul, which is why he wanted to get David killed by making him get 100 foreskins, which David recalls here. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Give me my woman Michal, even though she's been given to Paltiel, called Palti back in 1 Samuel, to whom I became engaged. And the word for engaged here, in this form eriseti, in the root you see here, is only here in Samuel. It's only a couple times in Deuteronomy, and once in Exodus and here in Hosea. We can see in Deuteronomy here, it's about somebody being violated, a young woman who's engaged, which comes out in Genesis 34. So that's an interesting parallel, not between Deuteronomy and 2 Samuel, but between Deuteronomy and Genesis. And I've already been noting many parallels between Genesis and 2 Samuel. So a lot of intertextuality going on there. So to whom I became engaged at the price of 100 foreskins. In other words, he bought her. As I've noted throughout, David is never said to love anybody, and even if Michal loves David, David is not doing this to recover his beloved. He's doing this to get his money's worth out of the 100 foreskins that he provided, risking his life, of course. And that recalls the scene that we saw back in 1 Samuel 18, 25, and 27. So Ishbaal, who we know is afraid of Abner, and David doesn't know that, although it shouldn't be too surprising. He understands Abner's role. Doesn't ask any questions, doesn't send a message back as far as we know, but just does it here. And as Halpern notes, it is Ishbaal, not Abner, who sends Michal to David in order to pull David away from his Philistine masters and lure him into an alliance with Israel. And that's from Halpern's perspective that David has never stopped working for the Philistines, much like Solomon will work for the Egyptians. Halpern adds further, the most suspicious element of the entire story. The text actually claims that he connived with Abner at his own dethronement here. And that's what we see. That Ishbaal, that is, not David, obviously. So Ishbaal sent and took her. And the irony is Ishbaal acting like a king, but taking a woman not for his own benefit, but to take her away from her man and give her to David. Again, no word for husband. Take her away from her man, Paltiel, the son of Laish, that we heard earlier in 1 Samuel 25. And then the writer gives this incredibly poignant scene, and we have to ask ourselves why this is here. We could have easily skipped verse 16 and gone from 15 to 17. The next scene, where having accomplished this, Abner sent words to the elders of Israel, and we'll have to consider next time the elders of Israel. But instead of just jumping there and leaving the politics of monarchy as it is, it adds this incredibly poignant scene. And as my note below says, a remarkable exposure of the victim of royal machinations, in this case the man as well as the woman, and the hard way in which the non-powerful are treated by royalty. We can also read this as a parable of exile, with David as the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, Michal as the exiles, and Palti as those left behind in Babylon as the exiles returned. And there are many little ways in which these serve as exilic parables and others, as we'll see when we get to chapter 12, when we have an explicit parable told by Nathan to David about a rich man, a poor man, a ewe lamb, and a traveler. It's a stand-in for the relationship with Uriah and Bathsheba, as we'll see. So her husband went with her. Her man went with her, using the word colic here 10 times in this little section here. So important key word there. weeping as he walked behind her all the way. And we've seen weeping before, and there's no sense that weeping is not male behavior. David weeps. He'll weep for the love child of him and Bathsheba, and he'll weep for Abner in just a few verses. We already saw him weeping for Saul. And he wept over his town of Ziklag. So it's not that weeping is considered unmasculine here, but certainly weeping as he walked behind her all the way to Baharim. And we don't know exactly where Baharim is. Understanding is it's just north of Jebus here, but he's coming from Mahanaim this way. And walked this way, and they're obviously going all the way to Hebron. So he walked some great distance before Abner finally said to him, "Go back home," or literally return, which is in parallel to Abner's offer to return Israel, as we saw in the play on words. This is the actual word for return, whereas the hiphal word that we saw there in verse 12 was to turn back, but it's basically the same thing. So as Abner offers to turn Israel to David, now Paltiel turns back away from Michal on her way to David, and so he went back. And so that completes this little section here of getting Michal back to David and another abuse of women. And we're going to see what the elders of Israel say when Abner proposes that they join him in accepting David as king. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.